Good afternoon. My name is Anthony Bass, and I'm the Senior Program Manager of External Engagement and Culturally Powered Communities of the Greater Twin Cities United Way. Thank you for your time and commitment to the community. 2020 has been very challenging for us all. Today, our hope is that we can help play a small role in helping you become a change maker as we move our community forward. Before we get started, please note a few housekeeping observations. This session will be recorded. Please put yourself on mute and turn your video off. The Community Connection series is designed to inform community stakeholders and community leaders about effective tactics that will allow the community to work effectively together in order to resolve community conflicts, develop initiatives to disrupt systematic inequities, enhance civic identity, development, and highlight opportunities, and become more empowered to bring about constructive change in our region. Our objective today is to bring you closer to our work by creating shared deep dive conversations on the pressing community issues and the United Way strategic response. We want to recognize this unique space where we have convened both our donors and community partners. Your presence is most welcome and appreciated here today. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please use the chat function, which Carrie Johnson will be monitoring. When space is presented at the end of the presentation, then Carrie will announce your question at that time to the presenters. Lastly, engage and have fun. So at this time, I'd like to introduce our speakers. Dr. Megan Gunnar, Gunnar is the Regent Professor at the University of Minnesota. Dr. Jakub Tolar is the Dean of Medical School and Vice President for Clinical Affairs at the University of Minnesota. Jaton White is the Director of Community Wellness at the Northside Achievement Zone, and Ann Soto is the Director of Grant Making at the Greater Twin Cities United Way. As you see before you is the agenda for today. I'm actually in the process of welcoming you here. Then I'm going to transition over to Ann Soto, who will lead the presentation. Here, the presenters will then lead us through a series of discussions where at the end we're going to have questions and answers, which will be moderated by Carrie. In conclusion, I'll come back to close and summarize the event for us today. At this point, I would like to transition over to Ann Soto, who will begin the session.
Oh, I was on mute. Thank you so much, Anthony, for getting us started. I am thrilled to have the opportunity to kick off our session today in a really powerful speaker lineup. I'm going to get us started by sharing the vision for our 80 by 3 initiative, which is a Greater Twin Cities United Way innovation initiative. So Anthony, if you could advance. Great. So to set the stage in our innovation initiatives overall, what United Way is seeking to do is form projects around timely needs in the community, as understood by listening closely to our nonprofit partners, donors, and the community. We work in collaboration with partners to create and support solutions, and then we amplify the results so that the learnings can continue past the life of an active project. Next slide. So with that, let's get into it. I know that all of you have joined today because you are interested in what we can be doing as a community to support the success of our earliest learners. 80% of brain development happens by age 3, making early years absolutely foundational to life outcomes. The goal of our 80 by 3 initiative is to expand our region's capacity to deliver trauma-informed, trauma-sensitive early childhood care and parent support. Like all of our United Way work, this is ultimately toward building a community where income, race, and place do not predict life outcomes. I am personally so grateful for two core partners, both represented in this call, that have worked with us on this initiative to date, Catholic Charities and Northside Achievement Zone. They have helped to inform the initiative approach, which is centered on growing early childhood provider capacity in 3 ways. The first, improve staff retention among caregivers to provide the consistency that helps children and professionals develop. 2, provide training, coaching, and professional support in trauma-sensitive practice. And 3, increase the capacity for enhanced parent wraparound support that includes comprehensive, persistent education, coaching, and benefits enrollment. The speakers that I'll pass off to in just a minute will speak to why trauma-informed care is so important and go deeper into what this looks like in practice. So I will end my section, next slide, Anthony, with our vision for success. Over 5 years, 80 by 3 will build sustainable networks of trauma-sensitive early childhood care and parent support in 4 local communities. Identify and publicize best practices that advance the field and build a comprehensive case for increased public support for these practices at scale. I want to, for a minute, acknowledge that we have several early childhood education providers, many of whom are already partners of United Way on the call. So let me speak to that. We are currently in a fundraising phase for this initiative, and I am very much eager to engage in how your organization can partner with this work as we launch. Some of your organizations may already be leaning into these approaches, which we'll want to learn from and highlight, and others of you are wanting to do better and maybe looking for support. So with that, I am now thrilled to pass off to Dr. Gunnar, who will provide a backdrop for the why for this work. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Anne. All right, the technical part of this is always the biggest challenge, right? So do I have control? And can I advance this? There we go. It's really a delight to be invited to talk with you today, and it's so exciting to have this initiative getting underway. We are all here, of course, because we are concerned with building a successful society, and we believe, and we will give you more data on this, that to do that, it requires being built in early childhood. We need to start there because we need to start with healthy child development. That forms the foundation for educational achievement, economic productivity, responsible citizenship, and lifelong health. These pillars support strong communities, a healthy economy, and terribly important, the successful parenting of the next generation, because we know that so many of our issues with early development are 2 and even 3 generational. So what does it take to have a healthy brain architecture and healthy early development? Well, it takes more than just having the right genes, though having healthy genetics is always lovely. In fact, it takes having the right supportive experiences. And we now deeply understand how it's not genes versus experience, but experiences. My gosh, in heaven, I thought, where was I? Was I muted the entire time, or did it just go off?
No, you're fine. Perfectly fine. Keep going.
I'm perfectly fine.
Yeah.
Genes literally write on our experiences, literally write on our genes and influence whether they are able to turn on or turn off. And this is something called epigenetics. So we all know we have DNA. Many of you don't know that DNA gets wrapped around little proteins called histones. At the beginning of a strand of DNA, there's usually a promoter region, and that interacts with the biochemistry of the cells that it's in, getting messages about whether to turn a gene on or less. Now, to get that message, that region has to be open to being able to interact with the environment. And what happens with this little thing called a methyl mark, there are several ways of doing this, but a little biochemical methylation will cause that that gene to be wrapped so tightly around that protein that the information about whether you should turn that gene on or off can't reach it. So it stays silent. Now, most of this happens, of course, before we're born, when we go from being a single-celled organism to a multi-celled organism. But what we now understand is it continues to happen after we're born. And here's a fairly dramatic example of how powerful this can be. This is studies of 8 monkeys. You can see them there along the top. 4 of them were reared with their mothers, and 4 were reared without mothers and just with other peers, other baby monkeys. When they were about 8 months old, they were sacrificed, and pieces of their prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that does a lot of thinking and reasoning, were removed, and they looked at over 1,300 genes. And what you're seeing here is called a heat map. So the redder it is, the more methylation there is, the more the gene is tightly bound, and green, the less. And what you can see is, it's not that one group all had open genes and all closed. No, what's happened is the different genes have been regulated to function differently. The genes in the brain of that monkey, those monkeys, and throughout the bodies have been adapted to function in a harsh or benign environment in a way that's going to track across these animals' lives. Another way that experience has profound influences on how we function is experience literally helps us wire up the brain. The brain becomes what the brain thinks about in many respects. So what you see over here on the left is again a region of the frontal cortex. People love looking at this. And these are neurons. And in order to send a message, neurons have to connect to one another. And as you can see, these neurons are not connecting. But what happens in this region of the brain is at some point, around 6 years of age here, because these are later developing structures, all of a sudden, all these connections are made. They're under genetic control, boom, there are loads of connections. And now what will happen is as that child thinks and uses that part of the brain, the things they think about will determine which connections get saved and which fall away. The brain becomes what the brain thinks about. Now, this whole process begins at the back of the brain, where we have vision and hearing pathways. Those, as you know, if you know babies, you know those get set up earlier. Then the child begins to figure out how to get their hand to their mouth, how to roll over, how to grasp things, and begins to sort out language in the temporal lobes. And finally, that beautiful prefrontal cortex that helps us do so much thinking and reasoning really begins to get organized. But if you notice, the foundations for all of this is occurring in the first few years of life. And we never think with one part of our brain. We use our whole brain to think about anything. And as we develop skills, those skills help us to develop more skills. Skills beget skills. So if we have a foundation that's weak and shaky, it's hard to build a beautiful brain on top of that. We can do it, but it takes lots more effort. But if we have a brain that is well developed, then we have an opportunity to move on with less effort to build a really smart, well-functioning individual. Now, I hope I've convinced you that stimulation is needed to develop the brain. And then I think you need to sit there and wonder, like I do, what was nature thinking? We are born probably the most helpless mammal on the planet. At birth, we can't get our hands to our mouth, we can't roll over, we can't see very far in front of our faces with any clarity. We are incredibly helpless. So we have no capacity really to provide ourselves with the stimulation our brains need in order to become the beautiful brains that we are hoping to develop in all our children. So what was nature thinking? Well, nature was thinking that the brain develops in the context of relationships. Relationships with parents, relationships with siblings, relationships with grandparents, with other children, and also with teachers. These relationships help to establish and develop the brain because the child engages in something we can think of as serve and return or call and response. The baby provides a signal, the adult responds. That signal from the baby required that the brain is active. And when the brain produces a response that gets, or produces an action that gets a good response, those neurons get confirmed. That's part of what helps the brain decide, keep this set of connections, let these others go. So in rich and supportive relationships, the brain has a wonderful opportunity to develop in a strong way. Now, one of the things that we know is that there is, unfortunately, an association between socioeconomic class and brain development. And this is not because poverty naturally causes poor brain development. It's because of the correlates of poverty. This is a study out of Wisconsin where they studied children who, can you see my cursor? I think you can. Studied children's brain development from age 5 months through 36 months. And as you can see, the total volume, the little gray cells, as our friend Hercule Perrault would talk about them, were very similar. But by the time we get out here to 3 years of age, those children who are being raised in higher SES homes with more highly educated parents with many, many more opportunities, their brains are actually physically different than the brains of children who are being raised in poverty. Why is poverty bad for the brain? That seems like a very silly question, right? But if I can advance this, it's bad for the brain. There are many building blocks of this, partly poor nutrition, especially micronutrient deficiencies, iron and other micronutrients. Poor and unstable housing is really rough on young children. Harsh discipline. If you live in a highly threatening environment, you do not sit down and have these long discussions with your child about why you need to avoid running into the streets. I mean, you're worried about your child's safety, and we all engage in more harsh discipline when we think something really bad could immediately happen to our children. Chronic understimulation, it's very difficult for parents who are working 3 jobs to provide the kind of stimulation their babies need. And these households are often rocked by what we can think of as toxic stress. That is, things that will produce chronic activation of stress biology. We like to think of there being 3 levels of stress. We do not want to remove all stress from children. They become really poorly functioning adults if they don't have any stress in their lives. There is such a thing as positive stress, brief increases of heart rate, mild elevations of stress hormones as the child learns to grapple with things that are difficult in life and finds that they can manage it. We think of tolerable stress, which I hope many of our families are actually experiencing. We can, these days during COVID-19, horrible stress, we would prefer not to, but in a supportive environment, children are going to be more than likely fine. It's the toxic stress that we worry about. This is the kind of stress where you get prolonged and large activation of stress response systems in the absence of protective relationships, or sometimes where those protective relationships are actually causing the fear and fear for the children. So the child has to go to those people that are actually at times frightening them. This is what we think of as trauma. We know that from studies of the effects of stress hormones, and in particular cortisol on the brain, that it will actually alter the structure of the brain. What you're looking here is a normal nerve cell with all of its connections, and a nerve cell that has been exposed to large and prolonged amounts of cortisol. These, if we actually look onto the processes here, what you're looking on is the dendrites, and what you're seeing there are those little knobby things. They're actually synapses. You've all heard of synapses. And what you can see on the top one is not only have there been a loss of processes, but there are fewer synapses in the bottom one compared to the top one that's been impacted by chronic stress. This means that these parts of the brain are actually not functioning as rapidly and as effectively. Now, we know that there are 3 regions of the brain that are pretty profoundly affected by stress. There's the hippocampus, which is involved in memory and learning. the amygdala, which is involved with fear learning, and the prefrontal cortex, which is involved with planning, self-regulation, and higher order cognition. Now, what's interesting, what's interesting is that what I showed you with stress reducing the connections and the number of synapses, that occurs in the hippocampus, memory and learning, and in the prefrontal cortex, planning and self-regulation. The opposite actually occurs in the amygdala, where chronic stress actually increases the connections. So what nature is doing, she doesn't hate us. Under harsh and threatening conditions, our brains are being biased towards act now, perceive the threat, quickly mobilize defense, and then think about it later, right? This is the kind of thing that creates a child that can be very difficult for people who are in preschool and early childhood settings to work with. This is a child when even everybody else doesn't see anything threatening, they've identified a threat. Their brains have responded and they've kicked in a defensive response. They are reacting and hitting and flailing. And your temptation is to look at the child and say, what is wrong with you? And what the kind of training, trauma-informed training, does is it helps those care providers step back and understand it's not what is wrong with you, but what has happened to you, and how can I make you feel safe and help you learn new ways of functioning and know that here you are okay. So I'm not sure how much time I have left here. Summary, the architecture of the brain is, this is tricky business here. Quick summary, the architecture of the brain is very profoundly influenced by our experiences. Skills beget skills, simpler skills support later developing skills. Poor early foundation affects all that is to come. Brain architecture develops in the context of relationships with serve and return experiences, literally building the brain. Poverty is bad for the brain. Toxic stress can literally shape an anxious, fearful brain that acts first and thinks later. These are structural problems that we can confront as a society. And I need to stop. We also know how to build strong communities. This is a list of the things that go into building strong communities, and it's all the things that we in the United Way, and the United Way is working on. So thank you very much. I'm going to turn my screen over to Dr. Tolar.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Gunnar. You are so brilliant, so powerful. I always enjoy listening to you, and I am honored to be here with you all. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to open the lens a little wider and go from where we are now, which is at the basis of the wiring in the brain and how the development of the brain goes, and try to position it on a societal, larger position. Next slide. And next slide. This just says my name, which nobody's interested in me. So what I think, when I think about development of the brain, I think about the responsibility that we as a society have for this, not as a little, effort here and little effort there, but really, how do we serve the communities where we live? And coming from the land-grant universities, such as University of Minnesota, this is written, in our foundations. So this is what we do for a living. This is why we exist. And that's why you are so important to us, because the only way Dr. Gunnar, myself, and others know that we are any good at this is if you tell us that we actually are. The point is that one has to be really aware of the social determinants of health that are really set up before children are born. They are set up in our communities, and they do have a tremendous continuum from the distribution of money, authority, resources. And they are, in fact, responsible for a lot of health outcomes. So they are not just that. They are not just social determinants of health. They are, in my opinion, a moral determinant of health, because access to normal development, access to normal essential healthcare is a fundamental human right. Next slide. The way we go from where Dr. Gunnar started, and understanding of how the rapid development of the brain is influenced by the external environment, is really going to the building blocks of who we are. So there's a beauty in how brain gets developed. There's a beauty in how it interacts with its environment before birth, after birth, and as a unit of the family. And as Dr. Gunnar very eloquently outlined, this is I think that's the implication in this. I'm sort of extending there, but my understanding of this is a collective burden. This is not an individual burden. This is not one of you or one of us or one of anyone. This is really the collective efficacy that will be so important to optimize the first 1,000 days of the brain development and the child's and family development. Next slide. Now, the children that are experiencing the stressors early in their life, sometimes they are nonverbal, sometimes, many times, always almost, they cannot really advocate for themselves. So that's why that is a burden for the society and a task for the society to solve. Now, the impact of this is unquestionable, indisputable. This is as rock solid as anything I know in science, which is that if you look at the life expectancy in the United States, it doubled between 1900 and 2000 from 40 to 80, but it had slipped between the 2015 and 2018, and it decreased. The last time this happened over the 3-year period was in 1918. That's when the First World War finished, and we had a similar pandemic as we are experiencing right now, but then it was called Spanish flu. Now, the reason why this is happening is what others have called disorders of despair. That is the addiction, suicide, drugs, depression, violence. That's why we are losing adults in what others have called maladapted adulthood. Now, if you want to intervene at the time that is in fact manifesting societally, it's almost too late. You have to really accommodate the prevention that we have seen working so well in vaccines, and start early. Next slide. The flip side of this is it's a tremendous opportunity. It's an incredible opportunity. It's the gratitude. I can look at the biology and the society and say, isn't this phenomenal that we actually have that window of opportunity that we can give the society and its families and the units and the people, children, mothers, fathers, the ability to grow to the fullest of their potential, and really in the process to become the best versions of themselves. Next slide. Now, yes? Is there a question? No? The formula, the math, the balance is very easy. You have higher plasticity at the beginning because that's of life. That is why, and that's important because that's how some of the fundamentals that are wiring in the brain are being made. And then as it cements in its functionality, it becomes less plastic over time. So some of the rapid development that we have at the beginning of life makes the brain simultaneously more vulnerable, but also more open to all these cues that Dr. Gunnar and others have talked about. Next slide. The important thing is that for the first time we have in the history of mankind, we have an ability to actually look at these connections. So the whole concept of science is based on the fact that we need to understand what is happening typically beyond the visible life, so like coronavirus, you cannot see it, but we'd better understand it so that we can do something about it. The projections that Dr. Gunnar has shown you, you actually cannot see it with your naked eye. You need a microscope, for example, or something like that. But the phenomenal arrangement of the brain is such that it is not the function of the individual cells, or even just the cells touching each other in a small group, but really it's the network. So like a muscle works, there's cells that are attached to each other. And, when you weight lift or when you run, you may improve, make them bigger, make them more numerous and so forth. And this way you can optimize or enhance perhaps the functionality of the organ. The brain is different. The brain is based on the individual cell really doesn't matter that much because it needs its neighbors. It needs its collective, and I see a quick analogy from that network, that really is the unit of function of the brain, to the network that we have with 80x3 and in the society and the people that are on this call that can take care and really makes functional unit only when networked and connected to each other. So this Baby Connectome project is the first time that anywhere in the world, we had an ability to map the connections in the developing brain. So what Dr. Gunnar and I are talking about, we can actually map it and see it with the enhanced imaging that we have uniquely at the University of Minnesota. And we have built this, and all the children are sort of put, at the regular, like to their cribs, they go to sleep, there's no drugs, there's nothing. They are not harmed, if anybody's wondering. And you just totally uninterventionally, map where are these connections that are built into the functional brain, and how can you understand the balance between the connections and certain pattern of the connections and the functionality, and where is it that it gives the child the best pathway, the most permissive environment in the brain and outside of the brain for the full potential of the development. Next slide. The University of Minnesota, of course, has worked diligently over the last at least 3 or 4 decades in building the sciences that are so important for this, because the simple thing about science is this is the best method that we have designed as a mankind to understanding our world, either within our bodies, without our bodies, for everything from astronomy to the minuscule atomic size understanding of things. But the how you put it to service is where it is important, and that's where we just this year were able to put together, with a significant philanthropy and with phenomenal support from our partners, into the Masonic Institute for Developing Brain. This is the only place in the world, that has the community linked to the basic science, and the only directive of the whole is to give the service back to the community. Next slide, please. So why does this matter? It is very clear to everybody who is willing to look, that among many of the facets that we are tying into these adverse childhood events, these ACEs, race plays in this as a core determinant. And I think it is important to see that the differences are unavoidable, unacceptable, unless you are unpacking them and are ambitious enough and courageous enough, as you are, to bring them into the function, into the society. So at the moment, you have seen it, and I have seen it with the coronavirus, that health equity has been, again, made obvious, or I should say inequity has been made obvious by just the fact that the Black and Latino Americans are 3 times as likely as white Americans to contract the coronavirus, and twice as likely to die from it. That is unacceptable. This is absolutely something that has to be changed, and we have to do better. And that's why 80x3 and this Masonic Institute for Developing Brain coming together are the answer to more equitable and healthy future. Thank you. I will hand over to Jaton now.
Thank you, Dr. Tolar. Are you guys able to hear me okay?
Yes, we are.
Awesome. Thank you for that. I am going to put a spin on this presentation similar to, thank you for that, Anthony, to Dr. Tolar. I want to thank he and I cannot see, is it Dr. Dahl? I can't remember the other doctor previous to me. Thank you both for your presentations because it actually, thank you. It actually did half my work for me. So thank you guys. Anthony, I just actually want to go to the very next slide. And I'm going to recite from our mission and vision. This is NAS. And while our mission and vision is birthed out of the trauma and the disparities that are current here in North Minneapolis, we fully predict that there will be a tipping point. And at some point, we will have an impact nationwide. It just won't be Age of Time there or Sandra Samuels there. It'll be in a different space using the same type of framework. So I did want to let you guys know that while our mission talks heavily about North Minneapolis, it is fully our responsibility to make sure that we have an impact nationally. Next slide, Anthony, thank you. And we can stay right here as I talk. Today, I will be addressing the following questions. One, why is early childhood trauma informed practice important from the Northside, from a Northside community perspective? The second question will be, how has NAS invested in this? And the third question will be, what does current support or trauma-informed practices look like at the practitioner level? And how are we hoping to see, what are we hoping to see grow, or what are opportunities? So the first question is, why is early childhood trauma-informed practice important from a Northside community perspective? Here's what I'm going to say to that from a NAS perspective. Keeping this screen up, you'll notice that one of the NAS facts is advancing racial equity for all. And the last one being transforming our community using data and learning. So trauma-informed practices, and we have a spin on, we're not just talking about you being trauma-informed, we want you to also be trauma-responsive. And so we, along with the majority of the base being our educators, but we also work with 2Gen, and so trying to help families both historically and in the future bring in our wellness framework. The point of the wellness framework when it comes to early childhood trauma is we have this belief that NAS is the earlier you get started, you're changing the success rate for the children in our community. And so this model was actually birthed out of early childhood. We had noticed some of the struggles that early childhood practitioners or educators were having connecting with our families that are highly mobile, victims of high toxic stress environments. And we noticed that the educators in particular were also showing up full of high stress, full of their own traumas. They have their own set of beliefs. And so those were bumping up against the family set of beliefs. And so we decided to, you can go to the next slide, Anthony. We decided that we needed to not only take an approach that would help folks understand what trauma is, but it would also give you tools to be responsive to how you're feeling. So you're responsive to your triggers so that when you engage with a child who is actually triggered, you are able to settle that child. So learning how to use your beliefs and your techniques differently. I'm sorry, somebody trying to say something to me? I'm sorry.
No.
Okay, I'll just keep going. And so from a Northside community perspective, getting started with our earliest children is our highest priority. And there's a firm belief that anything that works for early childhood works K-12 and beyond. So we're going to stay right here. Anthony, I want to address the next question was, how has NAS invested in this? Actually, if you can go to the next slide, the next two slides. Go to slide 5, Anthony. Thank you. One of the things that we discovered is that our educators and practitioners that work with families don't necessarily get trauma-informed or trauma-responsive training and or education when they're coming through their professional experiences. And so we've got a bunch of friends across the nation that are experts, as well as some under our own umbrella in what we're calling trauma-informed and trauma-responsive practices and tool bags. And so we develop, part of our strategy is offering consultation to educators, and they can bring their cases, if you will, the children that they call high flyers or parents that are unresponsive or their issues with their leaders into a consultation space and get some support there and fill up their tool bag and know how to appropriately navigate those particular situations and how to get the best long-term outcomes for children. The other part of our framework is that we push into the professional development series of all of our educational spaces. And so we offer them customized personal development training around dealing with the trauma that educators hold within their own bodies with other educators and their leadership, and how that basically gets in the way of the children actually getting educated, and how they can use the new learning in those conversations and develop a plan that keeps children safe and educators responsive in a way that's healthy for the children and their families. The one part I want to get to in a hurry, because I only have a few minutes, is that we have every year we do an annual, what we call Northside Institute, in partnership with Washburn Children and Family. And in one of our bigger sponsors generally will give us a little money for this too. And it's just for educators. And when we say educators in our framework, we do not necessarily mean certified educators. We also mean paraprofessionals and the behavior staff, the building engineers come to our trainings, the school nurses come to our trainings, the therapists that support kids outside of school come to our trainings. These particular trainings are only for educators because we want to talk about the racialized trauma that enters their school spaces and almost overtakes their thoughts and hinders their connections and building relationships with their children, so that kids can actually have the outcomes that we all desire for them to have. And so that teachers, also most importantly, teachers stop leaving the profession. I don't know if you guys are aware, but we have a high teacher turnover in the United States, especially in urban schools like the ones that we're partnered with in Minneapolis. And so just how do we cultivate a healthy lifestyle? How do we cultivate a living, breathing culture that is inclusive for all children and teachers in those spaces, is what they learned in the Northside Institute. And this year, being in the virtual world, was completely virtual. We had 397 attendees, and over 80% of those people stayed for 2 days to get that training. The last question was, what does current supportive trauma-informed practice look like at a practitioner level? Again, I kind of went over that a little bit already. We do some professional development trainings with each of our schools. We do customized workshops with our partners. And you don't necessarily have to be a partner. If you're outside of us and you're still doing same or similar work, we will work with you virtually. The other part, again, is the Northside Institute, another thing that we do at the practitioner level. And then we also give the same resources that we apply for, and this is very important to me, that we give to our families and children. We do a lot of soothing them and making sure that they're safe and they're healthy and they have the needs that they're all their needs met. And we forget about that with our educators. We forget that they're parents. And they also sometimes have issues with their finances. They sometimes have issues with their health. They sometimes have biases that they're recognizing in the moment. And they need a space and need space and time to be able to process that without penalty. And so we work with their leadership to think differently about the things that the educators are bringing to the table. Instead of seeing them as challenges, recognize them as growth opportunities within the school building. If you can go to the next slide, I think I got a couple more minutes, if I'm not mistaken. Oh, I'm sorry, go up one slide. I'm sorry, Anthony. Number 4, slide 4. Sorry. And I'm going to close with this one. We formerly had a behavioral health framework. If you guys have known as, we had a behavioral health framework. The behavioral health framework was primarily for getting children and their families in a mental health way. So getting them, if they needed, if kids have anger problems, getting them anger management. If there's domestic situations happening in the families, getting the families to the right mental health support. What we discovered was, while we're doing all that help for children and their families, we weren't helping the teachers. And so we also now have a resource list for educators. So if educators need help with resources, helping with pay their bills, or they need help with finding a therapist, or they want to get more in depth with their own personal self-care, things of that nature, we have therapists as well as resources and tools that we do give to them. And then we follow up with them on their wellness plans just to make sure things are going okay, and same thing we do for families, and just make sure that there's nothing else that they need. And we do the exact same thing for school leaders as well. Anthony, that is all that I had. You could actually go to the very last slide. Thank you, guys. And I'm turning it over to Carrie Johnson.
Thanks, Jaton. And thank you, Dr. Tolar and Dr. Gunnar. And I just want to take a moment to just identify a great connection an aha that I had as you guys were, all three of you were sharing that brain network and the impact of brain development, and that 80% of the brain development happening by the age of 3. Just think about that optimal connections for brain development, and then equally the optimal community connections and networking that we need to have to make sure our kids are healthy and ready and experience the healing that they need in the face of trauma. I want to just start us out with a question, and I'll ask everyone who's listening, if you do have a question, please feel free to type it into the chat box now. I'll be moderating that as well. But I want to start us out by just asking, and maybe hearing from all three of you, we do hold a lot of certain biases about trauma. And we're all, on this journey to maybe learn a little bit more about how implicit bias sometimes often shapes our actions and even our inactions. What are some misconceptions or biases about people who have experienced trauma? In your experience, what are some biases that people hold?
Do you want to call on us?
Oh, yeah. Dr. Gunnar, would you like to start?
I knew I was in trouble by doing that. One of the things that I do want to make clear is, as we build this story about how profoundly important the first 1,000 days are in Jakub's terminology, or the first few years of life, and the impact that trauma can have on children's brain and behavioral development, we have to recognize that, boy, you don't write off any child who has experienced trauma. Development is probabilistic. It's not deterministic. So these things that have happened increase the probability of negative outcomes, but they don't absolutely determine them. And at any point in development, positive experiences can come in and help the child, an individual, learn to live with some of the things that they've experienced earlier. There aren't really do-overs in the brain, but there are many ways to work around the dispositions that we develop because of our earlier experiences. So it's for those of us who are trying to use this information to convince policymakers that we really need to pay attention to those early years, we have to also make it clear that you don't ever write a child off because of negative early experiences. Resilience is really works for us. We have the capacity, and as a society, we can increase the chance that all children will be resilient.
I'm just gonna amplify this, and this is Jakub. I'm just gonna say a version that I have heard over and over is sort of the equivalent of the callous. How about me? I had it tough too, and then you insert whatever this may be, and I think it's really important, that being sort of in vicinity of the problem is not helping the problem. And if people, sort of have this, imagine, you are in my shoes, they forget the part that it's still me in your shoes, rather than the approximation of what actually happens. I think having almost this sort of a magnanimous, this non-particular, non-local, non-self-regarding view of what needs to be done for all of us, is the right way to actually understand.
Thank you. Jaton? Is Jaton on mute?
Yeah, you're on mute, Jaton, just so you know.
I'm sorry, you guys. I'm having some connection issues out here at this big house. I'm kind of moving around. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
I'm sorry. I'm at a retreat space. I'm sorry. Can someone recap the question for me? Or is it in the chat?
Just thinking about some of the implicit bias, how it shapes our actions and inactions, and what are some of the misconceptions or biases you think people have about those who have experienced trauma?
I think I'm going to take it from an education standpoint and from a student's perspective. I think that in education, especially there's an assumption that every Black child has some trauma. And that's not the case, or that every Black child has the same type of trauma, which is also not the case. And I think when that happens, we put them in a space, and then we look at them and treat them some kind of way unconsciously, because we think we know what's happening with them, and we haven't actually done any homework. We haven't asked enough questions or built a relationship. So that would be how I would answer that question.
Great. Thank you for that. Thank you.
No.
We do have a question that came in through the chat, and it's we have the other side of trauma treatment is trauma avoidance. And just a question about could you speak to something about the value of the greater investment in high quality early learning experiences, especially for children who are from lower income backgrounds? And we'll start with Dr. Tolar this time.
Yes, ma'am. So very good question. And I would put it in the category of, what Representative John Lewis called good trouble. You actually have to get to a necessary trouble, because the gap in the achievement gap, as everybody knows, by race, is incredible in Minnesota, and it's so much in contrast to when you get to, say, university level or even college level. And I think the important on the stress on the early learning, and as it is in the continuum with the avoidance of the trauma, is something that needs to be shaken up and truly redrawn in the society. Back to you.
Yeah, thank you. Jaton, would you speak to this?
I like this question, and I love the way, was that Dr. Tolar?
Yes, ma'am.
I love your response to that too. I want to say that avoidance is a response, right? It's an actual response to avoid, right? And so I think when you find yourself actually avoiding, we should dig into that, which is something that we embrace, we encourage at NAS, right? Lean into that, and have a conversation about it and be transparent. But I'm leaning towards what Dr. Tolar's saying. I don't think there's much more you can add to that particular question.
Great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Megan, can you speak to this as well?
Yeah, I read Rob's question a little bit different. I don't think he really meant avoidance. I think he meant, what can we do to help build that child up so that when negative things occur in their life, they're going to be able to rebound better? And is that part of the importance of investing in high quality early learning experiences? And it is, because one thing that we know about resilience is that as you have more positive experiences, as your brain and body are developing in a healthier and healthier way, it's really helping create a more resilient individual, and who will be able to withstand the ups and downs of the normal ups and downs of life much better, because that's actually good trouble, as Jake was saying, but also will be able to withstand some of the traumas, in part because they will have built some solid relationships with their teachers and others. That's part of what you're doing with early childhood education, is you're building solid and good relationships, not only with your teachers, but between the parents and the teachers. It's a network that we're building for children that can help hold them when bad things happen. So absolutely, we shouldn't just be worrying about trauma treatment. We should be helping to build resilient societies and resilient children and resilient networks. And that's what NAS is working on unbelievably to do, that can hold children when bad things happen.
Yeah, right on, absolutely. And I'm sorry, I misunderstood the question, but totally, yes.
Yeah, no, I think both perspectives on how we think about trauma avoidance as a protective factor and trauma avoidance as ignoring it, or having that, like you said, that inaction, or that avoidance is still a response, although not always a helpful one.
Right.
I'm looking at the time, and I'll just encourage anybody, if you have any last minute questions, to put that in the chat. And as we field some of that, I would just like to hear from all three of you. You know, you've all been immersed in this work for some time now. After hearing about the 80x3 initiative and you know, learning a little bit more about the strategies that we shared on, what's one thing about this initiative that really gives you hope?
The commitment, the ability, you know, to know that it is the continuous action that we all must take, and that it is daily strokes of effort of many people that will make it reality.
Great, thank you. Jaton, did you want to go next?
I think I've shared this when we were in our original meetings together. The fact that this initiative exists gives me great hope, especially for children that look like me. And the ones that we support in Minneapolis and beyond. One of the things I think is incredible, even though it gives me hope, is the hope that it's actually going to give our families when this is a full-blown initiative, and the possibilities that will unleash in their household will be limitless. So I just appreciate the conversations happening and that there's some movement behind it.
Great, thank you. Dr. Gunnar?
Well, you know, I think it's wonderful that we have the opportunity to use the United Way and this initiative to bring together all of the folks who have been working on addressing the issues of early childhood and the needs of young children. The Pre-to-3 forum group that's led by the Elders for Infants and Dave Pinto, all the various organizations that are represented here today, including not the least of which is NAS, but there are many of others that are here. And we can't help but be fragmented to some extent. I think this initiative can help pull us together and make a mighty, mighty force that will actually create change. So that is certainly my prayer, that can happen. And I'm sure that probably goes along with all the rest of you, with the hope that we can pull together and become a mighty force.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for that. And thank you for this opportunity to have a short but very meaningful question and answer session with all three of you. And with that, I'll allow Anthony, do you want to close up here?
Thank you, everyone, panelists, staff, donors, and community leaders. Just so you know, a video link of today's session will be included in the newsletter that's sent out monthly. Our next Community Connection Series event will be Full Lives, and that will take place October 14th from 1 till 2 o'clock. And I'd just like to close with a statement that we would like to live by a commitment of living inclusively. I commit to being intentional in living inclusively. I commit to spending more time getting to know myself and understanding my culture. It is in understanding myself that I am better positioned to understand others. I will acknowledge that I don't know what I don't know, but I will not use what is unconscious as an excuse. I will be intentional in exposing myself to difference. If I don't know, I'll ask. And if I'm asked, I will assume positive intent. Most importantly, I will accept my responsibility in increasing my own knowledge and understanding. I commit to speaking up and speaking out, even when I'm not directly impacted. For there's no such thing as neutrality in the quest for equity, justice, and inclusion. I will strive to accept, not just to tolerate, respect, even if I don't agree, and be curious, not judgmental. I commit to pausing and listening. I will be empathetic to the experiences and perspective of my others. I will use my privilege positively and get comfortable with my own discomfort. I commit to knowing, getting, and doing better than I did yesterday, keeping in mind my commitment to live inclusively is a journey and not a destination. Thank you all, and have a great day.